The border town was alive with chaos, the kind that never truly slept. Wagons rattled over uneven stones, horses snorted in the heat, and whiskey-laced laughter spilled out of crooked saloon doors. Dust hung in the air like a veil, settling over the crowd gathered in the square. The auctioneer's booming voice rose above it all, hammering like a drum against the hearts of those who came to bid. Some came for cattle, some for horses, and others for things that money should never buy. Yet here, at the edge of civilization, gold carried more weight than mercy. She stood at the far end of the line, the last of the women. Her dress was plain, faded by the sun, and her hair loosely tied back, strands falling across her face. Unlike the others who had already been claimed with raucous cheers and leering hands, she kept her eyes low, refusing to meet the stares cast upon her. Yet beneath the silence of her posture burned a strength unbroken by humiliation. She was weary, yes, but not crushed. Those who looked closer would see it, though most men were too blind with drink and greed to notice. The crowd muttered restlessly, jeers spilling forth. "She's too thin," one man shouted. "Not worth the feed," another laughed. Someone tossed a coin at her feet, mocking her as if she were livestock. The auctioneer tried to rouse interest, his voice cracking with forced enthusiasm, but even his words lacked conviction now. This was the last lot, the forgotten bride no one wanted. A murmur of impatience swept through the square, boots scuffing the dust, hats pulled low, as the men turned their attention toward whiskey and cards waiting just beyond. She lowered her head further, bracing for rejection. Then the silence shifted. It wasn't the auctioneer's voice or the drunken laughter. It was the sound of boots cutting slow and steady across the square. From the edge of the crowd a figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, his movements deliberate. The cowboy's face was shadowed beneath the brim of a weathered hat, but scars cut deep along his cheek and jaw, each a mark of hardship endured. His coat was worn, his boots dust-caked, and his left arm carried a stiffness that hinted at old injury. The townsfolk fell quiet as he approached, whispers stirring at the edge of awe. He had the look of a man who had lived through storms most would never survive. Years of solitude clung to him like a second skin, and though his expression was hard, his eyes carried something different, something unspoken, a weight that set him apart. The auctioneer stuttered mid-sentence, uncertain if the cowboy's steps meant intent or curiosity. No one dared call out, not when the air seemed to bend around his presence. The woman at the end of the line raised her eyes just enough to glimpse him, and in that fleeting glance she saw not cruelty, but pain. He stopped before her, the crowd holding its breath. For a long moment he said nothing, only studied her with an intensity that burned hotter than the sun beating overhead. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, not from fear, but from something deeper, an unspoken recognition, as though destiny itself had drawn them together. Then slowly his hand lifted. The gesture was simple, unembellished, but in the charged silence it thundered louder than any bid. The auctioneer's mouth opened in surprise, his voice faltering before he announced the claim. A ripple of shock passed through the watching men. "Her," the cowboy said at last, his voice gravel-rough from years of wind and whiskey, yet steady as stone. The word carried no hesitation, no bargaining, no jest. It was not spoken as a purchase, but as a declaration, one that silenced the murmurs and stilled the mocking laughter. The auctioneer stammered, then slammed his gavel down onto the wooden block, sealing the exchange with finality. Gasps followed, mixed with disbelief. Some shook their heads, muttering about wasted coin. Others sneered at the thought of such a man choosing the unwanted. But none dared voice more than whispers. The chain was unfastened from her wrist with a clang of iron, the weight falling away at last. She swayed slightly, the sudden freedom almost disorienting after hours of standing bound beneath the sun. As the crowd parted, the cowboy stepped closer, his shadow falling across her like a shield. He didn't reach for her, didn't grip her arm as others had done with their prizes. Instead, he waited, allowing her to move at her own pace. Confusion rippled through her chest. Who was this man, and why had he chosen her when so many others had turned away? The townsfolk began to disperse, some returning to their drinks, others lingering at a distance, eager to gossip. Yet in the square, the silence remained between the two of them, charged and fragile. She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes fully for the first time. They were not the eyes of a conqueror, nor the eyes of a man seeking to break her spirit. They were the eyes of someone who had been broken himself, stitched back together by sheer will, carrying scars not just on his skin, but in the depths of his soul. And in them she saw recognition. Her voice trembled when it finally came, a whisper soft enough to be carried away by the breeze. "Why me?" she asked, each word soaked in disbelief, in the exhaustion of being unwanted for so long. His jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened, but his gaze never wavered. He breathed deeply, as if drawing the strength to speak. "Because I know what it means," he answered, his tone quiet but firm. "To be left behind." The words struck her heart with the weight of truth, not promises or empty flattery, but the simple honesty of a man who had known loneliness. The auctioneer shuffled his papers and coins, pretending not to hear, though his ears burned with curiosity. Around them, life in the border town carried on, the rattle of wagons, the holler of gamblers, the wails of a fiddle spilling from the saloon. But for the two of them, the world narrowed to that single exchange, that single moment where a choice was made not out of greed or lust, but out of something different. She didn't yet have a name for it, but she felt it settle in her chest like a seed, fragile but alive, waiting to take root. As he turned to lead her away from the square, she followed with hesitant steps, her wrist still tingling from the iron's release. Whispers trailed them, speculation crackling through the crowd like dry brush fire. Some laughed, others scoffed, but none dared challenge the cowboy as he walked with measured stride toward the edge of town. His hand never touched hers, never guided her with force. He simply walked ahead, glancing back once to ensure she followed. For the first time in years, she felt the faint stirrings of choice, of possibility. Freedom had not yet come, but hope had. The dust of the square settled behind them, the jeers fading into the distance. Ahead stretched the vast frontier, wild and unforgiving, yet holding promise untold. She breathed deeply, tasting the dry air as though it carried new meaning. The cowboy's shoulders sloped beneath the weight of his own unseen burdens, but beside him she no longer felt invisible. She was no longer the last bride, the unwanted one left behind. She was the one he had chosen, not out of pity, but out of understanding. And in that moment, beneath the burning sky, both their fates were sealed forever. The iron chain clattered to the ground, heavy links curling like a snake in the dust. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the kind of restless noise born of disbelief and curiosity. The cowboy stepped forward, his boots thudding slow and steady against the worn planks. She raised her eyes, hesitantly at first, expecting cruelty in his gaze. Instead, what she found was something far rarer. A gentleness haunted by pain, a kindness roughened by years of solitude. The world had forgotten such eyes, but now they rested on her, steady and unflinching. For the first time, she dared to hope. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Why me?" The words carried more than confusion. They carried the weight of every rejection, every night spent invisible, every cruel glance that had made her feel less than human. He stopped in his stride but didn't release her gaze. His jaw tightened, the muscle shifting as though he were swallowing back memories too bitter to voice. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, like gravel rolling underwater. "Because I know what it means to be left behind." There was no poetry in his answer, only truth stripped bare by suffering. The auctioneer shuffled awkwardly, eager to clear the square for the next spectacle, but no one moved. All eyes remained fixed on the pair, the scarred cowboy and the forgotten bride. The air seemed charged, humming with something no one could name. He turned then, motioning for her to walk with him, his movements unhurried but firm. She hesitated, glancing once more at the life she was leaving behind. The mockery, the jeers, the chains, and then stepped forward. Each stride carried her further from despair, closer to an unknown future. She didn't know him, not yet, but she trusted the silence between them. They passed the edge of the square, the saloon doors creaking open with bursts of laughter behind them, the smell of whiskey thick in the air. A fiddler struck up a song, its wild notes chasing after them like taunts, yet neither of them looked back. The townsfolk whispered, some shaking their heads, others nudging each other with sly grins, already crafting stories of scandal. But the cowboy walked as though none of it mattered, and she followed, her bare feet silent against the dust. The world they left behind was small, petty, bound by cruelty. The horizon ahead was endless. The street narrowed as they approached the edge of town, the last buildings giving way to open plains. She studied him quietly, her steps falling into rhythm with his. His coat was frayed at the edges, the leather cracked with age, but it carried the scent of campfires and long journeys. His shoulders sloped under invisible burdens, and his hat shadowed the scars across his cheek. Yet even in his brokenness, there was a strength that unsettled her. He didn't stride like a victor claiming spoils. He walked like a man who knew loss, who carried it like a second skin. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly, her voice barely carrying over the crunch of gravel. He paused only a moment before answering. "No," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I've lived too long with silence. Maybe it's time I lived with something else." She wasn't sure if he meant her or simply the idea of not being alone. Still, the words pressed warmth into her chest. She tightened the shawl around her shoulders, realizing how different this was from the hands that had reached for her before. Hands that claimed, demanded, and took. His hand had simply chosen. By the time they reached the edge of town, the sun was dipping low, casting the prairie in gold. A single horse waited there, tethered to a weathered post. Its dark mane shone against the fading light, its body strong and restless. She faltered, unsure if he meant for her to mount. But he moved first, loosening the reins and patting the animal's flank. "We'll ride until nightfall," he said. His voice carried no command, only quiet resolve. She nodded, climbing onto the saddle with more grace than she expected from herself. When he settled behind her, the world seemed to shift. The horse moved beneath them, steady and sure, carrying them away from the crooked roofs and jeering voices of the town. The land opened wide, rolling hills stretching beneath the crimson sky, the air scented with sage and dust. For miles they rode in silence, the rhythm of hooves filling the void between them. She could feel his warmth at her back, steady as the heartbeat of the earth itself. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick with unspoken thoughts, with questions neither dared ask yet. And for the first time in years, she felt the chains inside her begin to break. Night fell, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds thrown by careless hands. He led the horse off the trail to a small grove of cottonwoods, where a stream trickled softly in the dark. He dismounted first, then offered his hand to her, not pulling, simply waiting. She placed her fingers in his, trembling with unfamiliar trust, and let him help her down. He built a fire with practiced ease, sparks leaping into the night air, and the crackle of flames soon warmed the silence between them. She sat opposite him, her shawl wrapped tightly, watching his face lit by firelight. "You don't even know my name," she said finally, breaking the quiet. He looked up, his eyes reflecting the fire. "Then tell me," he replied simply. The words carried no urgency, no pressure, only patience. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Clara," she said. Speaking her name aloud felt like reclaiming something the world had stripped away. He nodded once. "Samuel." They let the names linger in the space between them, fragile and real, like seeds planted in soil long barren. In the stillness, it no longer felt like strangers by firelight. It felt like two souls who had found their echo. The night stretched on, carrying the cries of coyotes and the rustle of wind in the grass. He leaned back against a fallen log, his hat tilted forward, though his eyes remained open. She watched him, trying to piece together the man behind the scars. He had saved her not with strength, but with choice, and that alone marked him different from the others. Slowly, Clara allowed herself to breathe easier, her body loosening in the glow of the flames. For the first time in years, she did not fear the darkness. For the first time, she believed she was safe. Dawn came softly, spilling light through the cottonwoods, turning the sky pale gold. The fire had burned low, embers glowing faintly as birds stirred in the branches. Clara woke to find Samuel already awake, seated quietly with his rifle across his knees. His gaze was distant, fixed on the horizon, as though he were waiting for something. When he noticed her stirring, he nodded once, his expression unreadable. She rose, brushing dust from her dress, and for a fleeting moment she wondered what the day would bring, what their lives would become now that fate had bound them together. They continued their journey as the sun climbed, the prairie alive with color, the air crisp with promise. They didn't speak much, yet the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of two souls, learning to breathe in rhythm. Every mile carried them further from the chains of yesterday, closer to something neither could yet name. Clara glanced at him as the wind lifted her hair, and Samuel met her eyes briefly before looking away. In that brief exchange, she saw what words could not hold: hope. Fragile and terrifying but alive, and so they rode into the unknown, bound not by gold or auctioneers, but by a choice made in a dusty square, beneath a jeering crowd sealed with a single word. The frontier stretched before them, vast and merciless, yet carrying the promise of rebirth. Clara's heart swelled with something she had thought forever lost, the belief that love could rise from ashes, that broken souls could find each other in the wilderness. Samuel rode steady at her side, his presence a vow unspoken. Together they carried no chains, no past, only the dawn of something that might yet become forever.